Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, John Eberhart and Greg Godfrey are detailing for us their recipe for success for hunting pressured whitetails during the peak of the rut. All right, welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light and their Camo for Conservation initiative. And we will still be providing you our rut hunting songs of sorts, big whitetails, and the most wonderful time to kill deer. But we're going to put them at the end of the episode because my buddy Furter, aka Josh, doesn't know how to fast forward through parts of the podcast he doesn't want to listen to. So to make it easier for him, we're going to put it at the very end of the show. So if you enjoy those songs, you can still catch it after our show here today. But we do have a great podcast for you. We're talking the rut, the peak of the rut, the Super Bowl of our season. It is here. It's going on right now. And our guests today are going to help us explore a number of different ways to have success this time of year, especially if you hunt in places where there's a lot of hunting pressure. My guests have been on the show before. John Eberhart is a legend. It's likely that you know him. He's the author of many books. He's been on this podcast 5 or 6 times over the years. A absolute OG when it comes to killing mature bucks in places like Michigan or other heavily pressured states. He's also proven that these techniques, though, work in other states too. He goes to Indiana, Ohio, Kansas, Illinois, etc. And then our second guest today is Greg Godfrey. He's one of the co-founders of Tethered and another guy who's proven to be successful in many different parts of the country, especially with this mobile hunting strategy that he's really perfected with his saddle system there at Tethered. So that's what we have in store for you today. And we have had John on the show a number of times, and we've touched a little bit on some of his rut techniques, but today we are getting into a level of detail that we've never before. The entire show today is just getting into the nitty-gritty of how he and Greg think about hunting the rut. So we cover everything from the various types of locations you'll want to focus on during this time period of the year. We get into a lot of the philosophy around deciding how long you should stay put in a location versus moving and, being mobile. We get into a number of other techniques, decoys, calling, all sorts of good stuff. This one will be very actionable, very useful for you in the upcoming days, whether you hunt in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Georgia or Ohio, whatever it is. We got you covered here. It's going to be a good one. John and Greg co-authored a book that just came out recently. It's called The Ultimate Guide to DIY Books. Here it is right here for those of you watching. There's actually 3 books. It's a 3-volume set. So we cover a lot that's mentioned in that book as well. So check out those after the podcast if you want more from Greg and John. And I think that is it. I think we can get right into our show today. I will mention that there's a new film from myself over on the MeatEater YouTube channel, so you can check out my Nebraska whitetail hunt from last year. It was a really exciting hunt. Things got turned upside down from what I thought they were going to be. I had to kind of create a brand new plan on the spot, found a way to get on some deer on the ground without trees. It's an interesting one. You can find it. You can watch it at the MeatEater YouTube channel. I appreciate that. And that is it. I think we should get into our show. If you are out there hunting right now in mid-November or that second week, whatever it is, I'm wishing you the best of luck. Stuff should be great out there. This is what we have waited all year for. So enjoy it. Put in the time. Stay optimistic. Just remember that anything is possible this time of year. So I'll be pulling for you. That said, let's get to my chat with John and Greg. All right, here with me back on the line, both of these gentlemen are returning guests. I've got Greg Godfrey and John Eberhart. Gentlemen, thank you for making time to do this right in the heat of the rut and all the excitement that's about to hit.
Thanks for the opportunity. Always appreciate being on your show.
Yep, it's always fun to talk to Mark, one of the what I call the OGs of whitetail podcasting content. I think, Mark, you kind of started it way back in the day, back in the early Wired to Hunt days. So it's I'm always, well, I've been on the show once, but it's really cool to be invited back. It means a lot to me personally.
Well, right back at you guys. I appreciate it. And Greg, your product and ideas around that product have changed my hunting in a big way. And John, I've said this to you 1,000 times, but your early books and everything were instrumental in my journey too. So all the way around, this is good stuff. It's exciting stuff. And as we just said, you both have been on the podcast before, but we have never done a podcast that was strictly all things, let's dive deep into the rut. And that's what I want to do here today, because when this podcast drops, it will be November 7th. So for a lot of people, that's going to be like peak rut. This is their rutcation. This is when they're taking their time off. There's a lot of people over the next couple weeks that are looking at this as their Super Bowl. And I know you guys put some extensive time and effort into discussing this time frame in your latest book series. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of dig into the nitty-gritty of that. And maybe the place to start would be in breaking down how you guys look at the rut and how deer behavior changes through that. Because within your book, or books, I should say rather, you kind of separate it out into 3 different phases. Everyone's got different ways they like to define the rut and how they break it down. But you guys kind of broke it down by pre-rut, peak rut, post-rut. Before we get into the actual how you set up and hunt each one of those different things, maybe John, would you kick us off by just walking me through how you think about deer behavior changing through those 3 periods of the rut and what the time frame is that you are kind of breaking those 3 chunks into?
Yes. Pre-rut is probably my favorite time of the season. And the rut in general is like the playoffs. It's like, making the playoffs in a sport activity, because that's where you want to focus your most attention. If you're going to get any vacation time, that's when you want to spend it in the woods. But during pre-rut, the mature bucks, which have primarily, if you're in a pressured area of any semblance, have primarily been pretty nocturnal outside the security cover of their bedding areas. So as testosterone rises throughout the early season and through the October lull, it kind of reaches its peak during pre-rut, and those mature bucks actually start searching for early estrus does. If you're in an area that's got quite a few deer, there's always going to be a doe or 2 here and there that come into estrus early. And the testosterone has risen to the point, and they haven't bred since last year, and they want to get out there and breed. So the cool thing about the pre-rut is not a majority of the does are coming into heat at the same time, where during peak rut, a mature buck's typically going to be doed up most of the time. He's going to typically be with breeding estrus does. Because there's so many does in the area. Usually in a pressured area, probably the 3.5-year-old and older bucks to other deer, be does, fawns, 1.5 and 2.5-year-old bucks, the ratio is probably 40 or 50 to 1. So once an estrus cycle of the doe he's breeding is over, it doesn't take him long to pick up the next estrus doe. If he crosses her scent and she's with another buck, he just follows her and takes her away. So peak rut to me, because the mature bucks are doed up so much, it's hard to get on one. And then also the routines are totally out the window, because they're with does, so they're following doe routes, or they're in where does are bedding. So pre-rut, they're following set routines. All those scrapes that you find in the woods, that's what they're visiting, because the scrapes that they make are always near some sort of area where there's a lot of heavy doe activity, an influx of doe activity. Usually it's by oaks, apple trees, whatever the mast or fruit trees you might have on your property are going to be, or if you have property and you have food plots, there's going to be doe activity at the food plots. So that's typically where you're going to find scrapes along field edges, crop field edges. So they follow a routine during pre-rut because they're not breeding does all the time. And so it's much easier to kill a buck during pre-rut, which I term the pre-rut running about October 25 to November 5 up here in the Midwest. And it's just easier to get on a pattern if you hunt those active scrapes and they have the adequate security cover for mature buck activity during daylight hours. They got, from a bedding area to transition out of a bedding area to these scrape areas, as long as there's adequate security cover, they're going to visit those during daylight hours. A lot of times it's during midday. So pre-rut's my favorite time. I think a lot of hunters mess up their rut phase locations by hunting their rut phase locations too early, and they alter the doe traffic. And therefore, once you alter the doe traffic at your hunting location during the October lull, because by hunting it too much, that altered doe traffic is also going to alter the mature buck activity at that location when they start pursuing estrus does. As far as the post-rut's really kind of interesting because there's only a few states in the country where you can go and bow hunt, and we're bow hunters primarily. There's only a few states in the country where you can go and physically bow hunt bucks before the gun season. Because if you're in a heavily pressured state and gun season opens up like Michigan's October 15th, I think Missouri's the second Saturday in November, so is Nebraska. So, their gun seasons are during the peak rut. So by post-rut, those mature bucks are pretty nocturnal, not moving much during daylight hours. So the only states really that you can do some good post-rut bow hunting would be Iowa, Kansas, which are draw states. What other draw states or what other states?
Ohio has a late gun.
Also has a late gun season. So those are the three primary big buck states where you can hunt mature bucks during post rut and still have a good chance.
So that's helpful, John. I guess what I'm curious about, and maybe this is the best place to start. Actually, let me take a time out and step one step back, because I forgot one thing I did want to ask you, Greg, related to what John just said, which was, I know you have experience down in the South where rut timing and rut stuff is just a little bit different. Have you seen anything in your time in Georgia or anywhere else down there where that deer behavior is different from pre to peak to post from what John just described? Or is it basically the same, but just different calendar dates because of the weird stuff across different states down there?
I think it's option B. I think the deer still respond in the South pretty similarly to what John described, but the calendar dates are all wonky. For instance, in Georgia, where I live, in South Georgia and Savannah, where I live, our rut starts in middle of October, and it goes through the end of October. It's much more aligned with more of a southern deer who, like the deer in Florida, can rut as early as July and August. And in the southeast corner of Georgia, they rut in October. Well, if you move more towards the middle of the state, where a lot of the deer were imported in the 60s and 70s from the northern states, like Wisconsin, those deer have more of a traditional November rut. And then the further west you go in the state, closer to Alabama, you get a later rut where they rut in January. So in Georgia, you can hunt rutting deer from October all the way through the new year.
That's crazy. I can't imagine that. So that's good to know. So everyone, wherever you're listening, you should, take this and adjust date specific based on your region. But in your guys' books, the way you broke it down was kind of the standard Midwest and upper 2/3 of the country timing, which is kind of that pre-rut being late October through maybe the first week of November. And then I think you guys defined peak rut as somewhere in that middle of November, week or two period. And then post rut was kind of like maybe Thanksgiving-ish on for a little ways. So with that in mind, the next thing I wanted to kind of steer us towards was some of the specific focus areas you guys detailed as far as rut hunting locations. And something I'd be curious as we go through each one of these would be you guys to share with me how you would hunt these kinds of spots, but then also how that might shift through those three phases of the rut. So, for example, something I know, John, you've talked about a ton in the past and you guys wrote about in the books, where you're focusing on scrape areas. So maybe let's start there. Could you talk about hunting around primary scrapes, scrape areas, and detail for us, how that shifts throughout the various phases of the rut, and specifically like how you find these and identify these, but then also actually set up on them? Because I think people generally understand, hey, if I find some great scrapes back in cover, I should hunt that. But fewer people know the right way to do that. So I'd love to start with this, and then we'll have a similar conversation around several other rut hotspots you guys detail. But John, can you kick us off with your thoughts here on scrapes, since that's so key for you?
I'm old and that's hard to remember all that stuff to respond to, but I'll try.
Give me the lowdown on primary scrapes.
Well, yeah, scouting is a huge issue to me. To me, scouting is 80-90% of the game, and I do the vast majority of my scouting during postseason, because after deer season's over, you can scout places. The foliage is down. The scrapes are still very obvious. Licking branches, rubs everything's really obvious, before we green up. So I'm looking for scrape areas of scrapes and mass trees, fruit trees, whatever the case may be. And when I find scrapes and they're in, if you're walking through a woods, like on public land, and you're out in relatively open timber and you might find a couple of white oaks or something with some scrapes there, that is meaningless to me, because for scrape activity that I find to be worth hunting, it has to have adequate security cover around that kill zone where those scrapes are, and it has to have adequate security cover to a known bedding area. So a lot of times the scrapes I find will be around perimeters of bedding areas. It's very common to find active scrapes around a crop field during postseason. I'll pick cornfield, and those scrapes were made during, if you were going to hunt those scrapes, you'd have to hunt them prior to the corn being picked. Okay. So once the corn's picked, with those scrapes being on the edge of an open field with picked corn, a mature buck's going to feel too vulnerable to visit during daylight hours. Year and a half and 2.5, yes, if that's what you're after, you can hunt those. But when you're hunting mature bucks, scrapes have to have some semblance of security cover around them, and adequate security cover to a known bedding area, or be around the perimeter of a bedding area or in a bedding area, for me personally to hunt them, whether it be pre-rut, peak rut, or post-rut. So the security cover aspect of scrapes is a big deal. And at least a very minimum of 50% of the bucks I've killed over the last, I'd say, 40 years have been scrape oriented. So typically it may be at a mass tree that has some scrapes, an apple tree that when it was dropping apples, the does were feeding there. So that's why the bucks made the scrapes there, or a chestnut tree or some white oaks along the edge, and as long as it has the adequate security cover, for daytime mature buck activity and movement, that's what I'm going to hunt.
Does that change at all once we get into that peak rut time, when it's November 7 or 10 or 13 and we're right in the heat of it? Are you still keying in on primary scrape areas, or does that shift as November plots along?
As the rut phase plots along, I don't hunt the peripheral scrapes that I would have hunted during pre-rut. When the rut phase comes, I'm in bedding areas a lot, because the mature bucks are going to push estrus does into security cover. That's where they want to breed them, where they feel safe, every 20 minutes or half hour or 40 minutes getting up and breeding a doe and, pushing her around. They want to feel safe and secure. So I love hunting bedding areas during the physical rut phases, or just inside the perimeter edge of a bedding area. But during pre-rut, I'll hunt scrape areas along edges of cornfield, as long as there's security cover butting up to the cornfield in the timber or swamp bordering the cornfield. Or I'll hunt an apple tree or a white oak tree that's got adequate security cover around the area and adequate security cover to a known bedding area. But your question was during peak rut. During peak rut, those peripheral scrapes outside the bedding areas, they lose the majority of their activity, because the mature bucks are with does most of the time, because the mature buck to doe ratios are so skewed. It doesn't take them long to pick up another doe, and they're with them a lot of time. So obviously, there's no requirement for them to make scrapes or visit scrapes. So that's why I like to be within the bedding areas.
Am I right though in thinking that things shift again once you get to the post rut, because the post rut's kind of similar to the pre rut? There's fewer does ready to breed, so bucks kind of return to that same seeking type behavior.
You're 100% correct. But again, if you're in a pressured state, that post rut activity is almost totally nocturnal. So, in those states I mentioned before, Ohio, Kansas, and Iowa, post rut's exactly like hunting pre rut. In fact, when we get drawn for Kansas this year, we got drawn for Kansas, and we like going during post rut. We prefer post rut because the mature bucks, they've been breeding for 2 weeks solid, at least 2 weeks solid. They're worn down. Their eyes are glassy. They've somewhat lost a lot of their security cover, or I don't know what the word is, their cautiousness, I guess. And now the majority of the does are bred, so now they have to do exactly what they did during pre-rut and go out and physically leave those bedding area haunts. And now they'll start working their scrapes again wherever there's doe activity, and they'll have a routine just like they did during pre-rut.
Yeah, so it's kind of like they're so preoccupied for the past 2 weeks of breeding does that they lose a little bit of that safety concern that they've had for the rest of the year. And so oftentimes you see those big mature bucks making a mistake at exactly the time period when you've talked about, John, when they've been screwing around with does for 2 weeks. They're tired. They've been in a whole bunch of fights. They've been kicking their buddies' butts, fighting back and forth up and down every ridge, and they kind of lose a little bit of their safety concern. And it's a great time to find those big mature bucks that don't make mistakes throughout the rest of the year.
Yeah.
Another stat. Can I throw a stat in there real quick, Mark?
Yeah, please do.
To give people an idea of rut phase hunting, midday is a big part of my rut phase hunting. Because when you're hunting in security cover areas, whether it be pre-rut or during the peak rut, I just lost my train of thought. That's what sucks about getting old. Midday. Big part of my kill strategy. I'm getting to the point where I can't hunt all day like I used to, as many all day sits. But to give you a stat of my 20 Michigan bucks that I've taken that made book, that I took between November 1 and November 14 with a bow, 7 of them were shot between 11 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, while statistically less than 8% of my time spent on stand was between 11 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's 35% kill rate with less than 8% of on-time stand. But it has to be, people will just go out there and hunt during midday and they're just hunting, in open timber or whatever. That's a total waste of time. It has to be in security cover, in a bedding area or a transition zone between a bedding area and another bedding area.
Yeah.
That offers
that's pretty eye-opening. I want to continue down that line, John, when it comes to your midday hunting strategy. But before we leave scrapes, really quick, I got to ask you, Greg. John has been like the prophet of scrapes for 30 years now, been preaching the benefits of primary scrape areas and everything like that. Are you as bought in to hunting primary scrape areas and deep in the cover scrapes during the rut as he is, or do you have a different take?
I would say the answer to both of those are yes. When John says it about deer hunting, you can pretty much believe it, that he knows what he's talking about, and that he's killed 7 book bucks in the most popular or most heavily pressured states, and he's figured out a way to get it done. So that's the first part. Yes, listen to John. Before you listen to me, listen to John. John knows what he's talking about. But I do have a little different take on it. While I agree with everything that John said, and he's right, I like to focus more on those transition areas. me personally. John likes to get deep into a bedding area, and the hardest place for a hunter to get. One of the analogies that John uses in his books is he says, that I've read in the past, bow hunting pressured whitetails, is he says, I like to pretend like I'm a deer and all the hunters are trying to kill me. And where would I go?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a useful exercise. And that's how John, a lot of his tactics and strategies revolve around that, which make perfect sense. I tend to like to hunt those little transition spots that are oftentimes terrain related. A saddle and a hilltop, a pinch point because of a river. I tend to like to focus on areas like that give me a very decided advantage that also contain the things that John talks about. So my ideal rut spot would be a big bedding area here, a big bedding area here with a big ridge that separated them, and a low spot for a buck to cross easily. And in that low spot, there's security cover and scrapes. That's like my number one spot to find. I like spots that I can get into with bulletproof entry and exit. Bill Winke wrote an article many, many, many years ago in Bowhunter magazine, probably 25 years ago. And the whole article was about access. And he talked about how there are tons and tons of good spots out there that hunters screw up because they aren't concerned with their access. So I love a spot that I can get into and out of without being detected, and that is going to be more of a transition spot than a destination spot. That's the only thing that I would say I rank higher on my hunt now factor is that. Which is basically the same as John, but it's just a little nuanced.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wanna touch on transitions that you just described there, but another scrape relay question came to mind that if I don't ask now, I will forget to do it. John, you had talked about, and maybe this was in the book that you guys were talking about this, but when hunting scrape areas or primary scrape areas, really this actually could apply to many different types of locations. But there had been discussion around the volume of hunts that you should give a given scrape or a given bedding area. And oftentimes we want to hunt new spots all the time. That's one of the benefits of the mobile style of hunting that all three of us use. But it seems like sometimes you have to give a location time to actually produce. Can you discuss that a little bit, John, as far as how many hunts you would throw at a good-looking primary scrape area or a good-looking bedding area before you'd say, okay, I need to move on because I've educated too much here, or I need to seek out greener pastures?
Well, first off, when I'm hunting bedding areas during the pre-rut or rut or the rut phase, I in the past anyway, I don't do it as much now. I always like to do all day sits where I'm in the tree an hour and a half before daylight, so to make sure I'm not spooking anything with my entries. They're not in there yet. And I usually like to leave about a half hour after dark, so I'm not spooking them with my exit. Usually within a half hour after dark, they've left the bedding area. So, and also I'm a huge scent lock fan. You know, I have used scent lock since 1996, and I pay zero attention to the wind. I don't get winded. Deer can cross my trail, whatever. So I'm not altering doe traffic by being in a location, and when I get in the tree and get down out of the tree, I'm still leaving residual odor at the spot. So if deer come in later or pass by later, they still smell human odor, and then they will avoid that spot. So I think the scent control for me makes a huge difference in what I can get away with. Now, during the rut phases, if I have a scrape area and it's it might have been active during pre-rut, but it's not active during peak rut, and it's along the edge of a bedding area or in a transition zone between two bedding areas, that's something I will hunt multiple times. I may hunt that 4 sits in a row, because during peak rut, the buck that I'm after may be with a doe. He may be with a lockdown with a hot doe. So, that's going to run 28 to 30 some hours. And so if I hunt it multiple times, there's a good chance once he's finished with that doe's cycle, there's a chance that he's going to, go visit those scrapes to find his next doe. It usually doesn't take him very long, but that's where the percentages lie. Is that's a spot he's going to go look, because that's a spot where there's heavy doe traffic, is where that scrape's at. So during peak rut, I'll hunt a spot easily 4 times in a row, as long as I know I'm not altering any doe traffic at that location. During pre-rut, I move around a lot. I'll go into season with almost 50 trees ready to hunt on public, or I've got 2 private parcels that I hunt. So I move around a lot. I don't like to burn any of my locations out during pre-rut. So usually during pre-rut, if I hunt in the morning and an evening, that's going to be it.
Okay. Greg, Greg, how do you think about that? Because especially, I mean, John, you're the same way because you use the saddle. But Greg, with you guys having saddle setups and you hang out with a bunch of saddle hunters, and all of you guys are mobile first guys that want to get around, want to hunt a bunch of different places. We are all steeped in the gospel of run and gun, freelance hunting, go make a move based on what you see. When you get into the rut, the peak rut, when it's really on, how do you think about this? How do you balance that urge or the benefits of hunting new places versus the possible downside of missing out on the action in a given place because you just didn't give it enough time? How do you handle that?
It's a great question. And I've heard you talk about this before, Mark, in your podcast, about how you're an adventurer at heart and you're always wondering what's over the next ridge. And, I have a little bit of that same disease where there's always a booner around the next bend in the river. And while that can be beneficial, it can also hamstring you. And so I make concerted efforts to try not to limit myself into only being a hop around hunter, I guess, for lack of a better term, a mobile hunter. For instance, I was just hunting in the suburbs of Atlanta this past week, and I hunted the same tree every single hunt. I didn't bounce around at all because of the spot. So this particular spot, the access was bulletproof. Now, I believe in scent lock. I use scent lock. Matter of fact, one of John's suits that he designed, called the Wind Brace from Scent Lock, I don't even think they make it anymore. But John got me turned on to that Scent Lock suit, and I still use it to this day. So I believe in that, but I don't use it religiously like John does. I still do pay attention to the wind. Anyway, the point of this spot was I could get in and out of this tree with 0 interactions with deer. It was basically bulletproof because I was able to access through a waterway and a swamp where there were no deer living, pop out, and I was in a bulletproof setup. And it was a transition zone. There wasn't a whole lot to keep deer in this particular area, but there were on either sides, and it was a perfect little transition spot. So I hunted it every day. Since the deer in Georgia right now are starting to get in their pre-rut phase, they're getting a little bit cruisy. We had one of the guys I was hunting with shot a deer that came in trailing a doe on full grunt mode, just grunting with every step he took. So that tells me that the deer there were starting to get a little fired up. And I thought that if I sat in this one spot, this perfect transition zone, that I could catch a big one moving through there. I didn't, but that's okay. So I think Mark, you're right. You have to be cautious of moving too much. But you also, if you're not seeing deer, you got to move. So you gotta find that fine line of being mobile, but also being patient. And I'm not always good at it because I tend to want to be more mobile. So I have to self-regulate. And I think that's good advice for hunters to hear both perspectives, and in that John saying, hey, it's okay to hunt these spots over and over again. I would add to the caveat of that, it's okay to hunt them over and over again as long as your access is bulletproof and you're not spooking deer, like John said, on the in and out. I'm totally okay with hunting the same spot over and over again as long as those other conditions are true.
Yeah.
But you also have to be proactive. I mean, the biggest buck I've ever shot in my life, 180 incher, I was on an all-day sit, and by 10 o'clock, I was seeing a lot of deer activity a couple hundred yards away because it was during the rut and the foliage was down. I had a long viewing distance. And so I got down at 10 o'clock. I pulled my steps when I came down, and I moved. I had a decoy out. I left that there for my exit when I was leaving. And I went back in and I found a scrape area from hell. There was 3 monster scrapes in a 15-yard zone. I set up in it. I was in that tree set up by noon, I would say, somewhere around noon. And I had deer funneling by me all the time. And at 4 o'clock, I shot that big buck. And then early in my hunting career, 1976, I still scouted during postseason back then, and I prepped the tree, and it was a red oak. And when I went back to hunt it, I didn't go do a speed tour to see if it had mast and was dropping mast. I didn't do any of that. So when I went in to hunt it, didn't have any acorns, so there wasn't any deer activity. And so I just freelanced back into the woods farther where I'd never been before. I found a white oak that actually was dropping acorns and had a lot of droppings underneath it. And I set up in that tree. I actually climbed the tree physically because it didn't have the steps and stuff they have nowadays. And I shot a 10-point. So, freelancing when something's not happening and there see better activity or that you go back to a tree and it doesn't look good, you've got to be proactive as long as you've got the gear there to make that move. So I agree with everything you said, Greg, but and you always, that's the cool thing about postseason scouting. In postseason scouting, you can cover every inch of everything you want to hunt on public land because spooking deer is irrelevant. But during season, spooking deer is not irrelevant. So you have to be very cautious on how you do that.
I think there's another little clarification I would say to my previous comments. You got macro moves and you got micro moves. So macro move is going to a completely different area, completely different ridge system, go around the next bend, whatever. But I also think I can illustrate what John is talking about. My first time I went to Missouri, out of state hunt for me in the pre-rut, public land in Missouri. And I would say I did a micro set of moves. So day one, hunting a tree, see deer movement like John just described in a different area, but still within, I call it my macro area where I was. Well, I moved 50 yards closer and it wasn't quite there. I wasn't quite in the right spot. So I made another micro move, probably another 40 yards into this one little tiny zone. And that ended up being the spot where I tagged out. So John's point is absolutely right. Sometimes you don't have to go a long way, but sometimes you have to refine your positioning with a micro move inside the bedding area, the transition area, if it's a crop field, whatever it is that you're keying in on. Sometimes those micro moves can really pay off in a big way.
Yeah, it's a great point. So if I were to summarize when someone should volume hunt a location. So coming out of this little bit of our conversation here, someone's still thinking to themselves, well, how do I know when I should be bouncing around versus how do I know when I should hold tight? I would say, to summarize what you guys have all said, number one, listen to the deer. So if the deer are telling you, hey, it's actually, you're a little bit off the X, most of the action's 50 yards over that way, then yes, make the move if you have to make that micro move, because listen what the deer are telling you. But vice versa, if you're sitting in a place and then you feel the urge to move just because you feel like you're supposed to bounce, but the deer are still telling you, hey, we're here. If you are still seeing steady movement, if you're still seeing young bucks coming through, or, if it's happening, don't assume you have to leave if you have that good access and exit, yada, yada, and the deer aren't figuring it out. So there's number one. Number two, if you are in the peak of the rut activity time period, as you described, John, if it's that time when bucks might be locked down, if you leave too soon, you might not have given that buck an opportunity to circle through because he didn't get off his doe yet. So that's number two. And then the third situation where I think it might make sense to volume hunt, and I believe you guys wrote about in your book, would be in low deer density areas, right? Where there's not a lot of deer. If you sit a spot for a day and you don't see anything come through and then leave already, that just simply might be because these bucks travel long distances in low deer density areas, and he might be a mile away right now. But if you gave it 2 or 3 days, he would eventually cycle through. Am I right on that, John? Did I describe that correctly?
100%. When you go to hill country or areas with low deer densities, yeah, the bucks, the mature bucks, have a lot bigger core areas, especially during the rut. They may cover a 5-mile core area. Excellent example, and I'll be brief. One of the guys that manages Jay's Sporting Goods, Chad Stearns, he was up in the UP gun hunting, and when he went up on top of this oak ridge, he bumped a big 10-point on the other side of the ridge, and he just watched his big antlers and body go over the ridge. So he hunted it the next day, that same, because there was a scrape there. There was a big scrape where he was at. And he called me and he said, John, I saw this big buck in this scrape on this ridge. And I said, Chad, he said, what should I do? I said, Chad, you know what? That's an active scrape. There's doe activity, because he said he was seeing does. I said, that buck will be back eventually. I said, I know you hate to sit in one spot for that long, but he was a big scent line guy too, so he wasn't worried about his scent. He sat in that spot, and on the 7th day, Sunday morning, the last day of his hunt, that buck came back and he shot with a 142-inch 10-point.
Nice.
It took him that long to circle back to that spot because he had such a big core area.
Yeah, it's hard in those situations. Yeah,
well, and I think trail camera, my experience with trail camera data it supports that, right? It in my experience, maybe it's different for other people, but in my experience, it's pretty common to see a buck for a couple, 3 days, and you get a picture of him, morning, evening, wherever. And then he seems like he disappears for 3 to 5 days or a week or whatever it is. And then a lot of times they come back. It feels like these deer, they work on little circuits. And I think all of the deer studies that I've read, either from MSU or for the deer studies that have happened that I've seen in Pennsylvania, seems to kind of correlate with that specifically in the rut, that these bucks, they kind of they have the little circuit and they're here for a few days, and then they kind of move to the next place and they're here for 2 days, and then they move and they kind of just make a little circuit around their core area. And I think that's a real thing, and patience, can sometimes be the better part of valor.
Yeah, that's especially the case during peak rut. During pre-rut, they tend to stay in tighter core areas. They're not branching out as far. But during pre-rut, they're much more routine. You're much more apt to catch them on camera more routinely. Maybe every 3 days you'll get a picture, or 4 days coming through with regularity. There's some consistency to it, whereas during peak rut, it's a crapshoot.
Yeah. It's all over the place.
Yeah. So Greg, a second ago, you had mentioned that one way you vary from John a little bit is that you might prefer those transition zones a little bit more. And if I might kind of broaden this idea of transition zones, I think the way you were kind of referring to it would be not just like a transition area, but more like transitions from place to place, that being like travel corridors or pinch points, funnels. You said the description of like a saddle between two bedding areas. So funnels, pinch points, travel corridors, that is like bread and butter rut hunting location. Anyone who's studied deer or been deer hunting or listened to a few podcasts know that hunting a pinch point or a funnel during the rut is a solid game plan. But the details of how to do that well, or the specifics of setting up on one in a smart way, there's a little bit more nuance there. Could you share with me a little bit more of how you approach those types of setups? What makes a really, really good travel corridor or rut funnel setup for you? Any examples would be really helpful. Basically looking for that next level of depth on something that generically everybody gets, but maybe we don't understand the details as well.
That's a great question. I would say a lot of it revolves around pressure. A lot of these transition, I mean, maybe we're using the wrong terms, but these pinch points, these funnels, these corridors that link different travel patterns, a lot of times they're really easy to spot on a map. If you understand satellite imagery, not every hunter does it, but if you don't, you should learn. You should learn how to read a topo map. If you're a hunter and you don't know how to read a topo map, you are wrong. You need to learn how to read a topo map.
You're missing
Watch
out.
a YouTube video. You'll get it, and it will open up your eyes to how deer use an area. See, deer are creatures of habit. They want to use the path of least resistance. And it's oftentimes not that difficult to pinpoint those on a map. A saddle, a bench that follows a ridge line, those are the places that deer are going to use with regularity. The trick is finding ones that other hunters aren't keying in on, okay? Because they're oftentimes very easy to find. So what I have found to be useful for me is finding ones that make sense, yet they're hard to access, either because you got to go over water, or it's a long walk, or it's really close to a parking lot, somewhere that hunters are overlooking for whatever reason. Could be hard to find. It could be so simple that nobody thinks that it could actually work. That happened to me in Missouri as well. I used a bridge to access a really obvious funnel. It was super obvious. Any hunter with any experience could have picked this out. It was really, really simple. But most hunters they were parking in a different spot, and they were coming in from a direction which was really obvious that a mature buck would situate himself in a bedding scenario to where he could watch that, right? Because a mature deer knows where the hunting pressure comes from. That's the reason they're 4 or 5 years old. They've been through these hunting seasons. They know where hunters come from. So they will oftentimes bed in a location that will allow them to see that pressure coming, and then they'll pop smoke and they'll take their exit route. Well, I think the reason that I was successful in this particular hunt was I came in from a weird way, and I climbed out from underneath the bridge and crossed a road where not anybody else was doing that. So a lot of times it's about creatively accessing those spots, and or finding ones that they're just not as no-brainers on a map. You know, it's really obvious to identify a lot of these places, and if it's a really obvious pinch point and it's 75 yards off a trail, like, it's going to get pounded. Mark it off, don't hunt it. It's not going to work for the most part. But look for those little pinch points that maybe are harder to find on a map, or oftentimes what I find to be true is if I'm going to a pinch point, a funnel, whatever, I'll oftentimes find little micro pinch points and funnels in that area. And a great example of that is you might get into a pitch point, call it a saddle, on a ridge system that's an easy spot to cross, but maybe there's a down tree that would funnel a deer into a really specific spot. Little stuff like that, little micro terrain features can often make a big difference. It's really about putting boots on the ground and going in and really understanding the terrain. That's kind of what I focus on.
Okay. John, would you add anything when it comes to funnels, pinch points, and kind of the next level of depth than just the generic?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of hunters follow what they watch on TV. And in my personal opinion, most TV guys, if they had hunt public land, wouldn't have a clue what to do. I think 50% of the bow hunters in the country could probably kill deer, the same deer that the TV guys are hunting if they were hunting the same property, because it's all ultra managed. So when you follow what TV guys do, TV guys can look at aerial maps and topo maps, and they can pick out spots on their properties, and they can go to them, and they know nobody else has ever been there. So it's very likely that they can go to a pinch point between two areas of timber where there's some adequate cover from point A to point B, and set up there and kill something. A normal hunter hunting public land or heavily pressured areas where there's 20 homesteads in a 640 acre section, and every homestead's got hunters on it, that's a pressured area as well. You can't do that. That's why scouting is such a big part of being a successful mature buck hunter. Scouting, when you're out there postseason scouting or even preseason scouting, I hate scouting during preseason, but I do once in a blue moon. You can see what kind of hunter activity is there. You can see marks on trees from stands or climbers or whatever the case may be. Or if it's super easy to access, you can be guaranteed other hunters are going to mess it up. So when I'm looking at pinch points, I'm looking at a lot of times river funnels. I've mentioned this on your podcast before. River funnels. People don't pay attention to that kind of stuff. But when you walk a riverway, a lot of times the river will make bends, and every time it makes a bend, there's going to be a cliff, where the water washes away the dirt under the bend. And then you may go a quarter of a mile or a half a mile, whatever the case may be, and there'll be a 100-yard or a 50-yard flat area. Well, when you get to those flat areas, the river's usually wider and it's shallower, and that's where the deer are going to cross. And they don't have to worry about the cliffs on all the bends. So, it's just like a trout fisherman. If you're a trout fisherman, you know exactly, if you fished a spot a while, where you can cross the river the easiest, and deer know the exact same thing where they live, where they reside. So I look for that, and then any funnel or transition zone has to have, I can't say this enough, security cover, security cover, security cover. If you're after mature bucks and there's any semblance of pressure in the area you're hunting, a mature buck is very rarely going to make himself vulnerable in an open area, even if it's in a transition zone. Like the river funnel, and they have to cross through 50 yards of open timber to cross the river there and then go into some security cover. They're not going to make that 50-yard vulnerable movement during daylight hours. So that'll be an after dark spot. So no matter the transition zone you're in, if you're after mature bucks in a somewhat pressured area, it has to have adequate security cover for mature buck to transition either through the security cover or along the edge of the security cover. They always like to have a quick 2 or 3 second exit where they're out of a kill range for a bull hunter.
Which is why it's so great to focus on the rut phase, because that is when they start letting their guard down, right? And that's when that's when these bucks, because John is 1,000% right. I could not agree more. They just don't make many mistakes. That's how they get to be 4, 5, 6 years old and last through several seasons. But once they get in breed mode, they will sometimes make those stupid mistakes, and that's how you can capitalize on it.
Yeah, if they're with a hot doe, they might follow her into Walmart.
Yeah,
they would.
So with these funnels, with these pinch points, I can imagine someone being out there in the woods, maybe public land, maybe a permission farm, whatever it might be, and he's out. Maybe he's going out to hunt that day in a new area, and he's kind of scouting his way into a hunting location. Maybe let's hypothetically say, and he comes across some spots that he thinks maybe could be good pinch points or funnels. They look like they could be one of these micro funnels you mentioned, Greg. And they're trying to confirm, like, man, is this the kind of spot that a mature buck would move through? And maybe he's looking for security cover, like you mentioned, John. But I got to believe some people will be thinking, hey, I need to see sign that will confirm that, yes, this is a good place. Like the terrain looks right or the cover looks right. But what is the what's the sign that matters to you during this time of the year, November 7 through 20 or somewhere in November? What sign do you need to see? We'll start with you, John. When you're trying to say, yes, this sign tells me that mature bucks will use this funnel.
Security cover. If it's a funnel and it has security cover and it's between 2 bedding areas, which typically during the rut, if a mature buck's moving during daylight hours, he's looking, if he's not with a doe, he's looking for a doe. So he's going to be checking a bedding area within his core area, and then he's going to take the best available transition security cover to the next bedding area that may possibly be within his core area. So, and also in a bedding area. To me, when you are physically in a bedding area during the rut phases, that's where mature bucks, push the does into to do their breeding. So if you go set up in a bedding area, those bucks are going to breed those does every 20 minutes to 40 minutes. And they're going to get up and, they're going to bed maybe 15 or 20 yards downwind of the doe after they breed. And then maybe 20 minutes, whatever the case may be, he'll get up and he'll go and nudge her and they'll play a little 30 to 100 yard chase game. And it's all within security cover. So if you're in a bedding area, as long as you're in an area where there's runways going by, there's always the chance at any time of day to get an opportunity to hit a mature buck. The only downside for most hunters when they're hunting within a bedding area is the wind. If you don't have a scent control regimen, typically on average 50% of the deer you see are going to be downwind of you because there's no rhyme or reason in a bedding area. Obviously, if you're in a bedding area and you have the option of being in an oak tree that's possibly dropping acorns, or at a scrape area that's within a bedding area, that's where you'd want to set up, as long as there was sign there from the, there's deer sign there and droppings in the area. But the scent control thing's a pretty big deal because you're going to have deer downwind of you. But that, in bedding areas, to me, people that leave bedding areas as sanctuary areas, if you own your own property and you own a lot of property, and you got a 10-acre bedding area, yeah, you can leave it as a sanctuary area because you don't have to worry about anybody else killing the deer, on your property. They're staying there. So, but if you're not in that, if you don't have that opportunity to own land and you're on public land, you got to be back in the junk where the bucks are going to be breeding the does during the rut phases. And and when they're pushing those does in those bedding areas, a lot of times, as you guys well know, it's on uncharted routes. Those does aren't always following runways. They're just running through the swamp or whatever the case may be. So that's
John,
one thing about the rut. The rut is something where anybody, even if they're in the wrong spot, could kill something just by accident. Yeah.
Question.
Right.
Would you define a bedding area as how you're describing it? Would you just talk about all that? I'd like to hear your explanation of what a bedding area is.
I get that question so much. Security government bedding areas, because bedding areas. Well,
I already know the answer, but I want to hear you say it for all the listeners, because I think it'll be useful.
Bedding areas can change from area to area. Like if you're in hill country, they don't have swamps like Michigan does and like Ohio does and some of the other Midwestern states. Southern Ohio, Southern Indiana, Southern Illinois, that's all hill country, or West Virginia, and bucks there will bed up on the tops of the hills. They'll bed where if the wind's coming over the hill, they'll bed where they can smell anything coming up the other side, and then they'll have a visual down the side they're bedded on it, on the other side of the crest. So that type of a bedding is different than where I live, which is, bedding areas are very identifiable. It's the thickest area, the densest area in the area. That's where the bucks are going to be. I mean, I'm not talking about like a blueberry marsh where you have to crawl over the brush. I'm talking about just areas where there's autumn olives or red brush or briar bushes, sparse stuff, marsh grasses, some cattails spotted here and there, hemlocks. Bedding areas are basically, if you were the deer and everybody was trying to kill you, where are the heaviest places of security cover on the property where you think you could go in and feel safe moving during daylight hours? That's the bedding area. So with that scenario, bedding areas are different from area to area depending on the topography. But you always want to look at it as what's the densest area and the safest place where I would feel comfortable moving during daylight hours within this mile section or within this public land. And that's where I would set up.
So, okay, here's another one. We talked about pinch points, funnels. That's another one that, everyone knows. Bedding areas, everyone knows you should hunt bedding areas during the rut, especially spots where there's lots of does bedding, right? We know you go where the does are bedding, there's going to be bucks checking them. But it's harder to pick the right spot in a bedding area. Can you discuss how both of you guys like to do that? So how do you find the X within a bedding area or around a bedding area, however you each like to do it? Because there might be a 2-acre zone where there's a whole bunch of deer bedded. And when you're bow hunting, that's a large area. It might be 10 acres or it might be a 1/4 acre. Obviously, they're all different. But how do you think about choosing the right spot, like the spot within the spot of a doe bedding area during the rut? Because this is really, really important for people to have success this time of year. One of the best places. John, you want to kick it off? Continue your thoughts there.
I've started all the other ones. Greg, you go for it. You go.
There you go.
First.
Great. So what I would do, let's say there's a big marsh and big cattail marsh, and it's obvious that there are does and bucks bedding in there. Sometimes you don't have to make it more complicated than it needs to be. I'm bad about that. I'm bad about making things overcomplicated. But what I would do, and what I've done in states where I would encounter a situation like that, is I would scout the edges, and I would look for the heaviest trails, runways, coming in and out of those spots that are marked with buck sign,
You're talking
rubs.
scouting. You're talking scouting in season, not postseason.
In season scouting, which is
freelancing.
That's right. Which is a little different than the way John typically hunts. Typically, not always, but typically, John has his spots scouted and prepped in the preseason, or what John says postseason, January, February, March, whenever snow goes away and before green up. A lot of times when I'm hunting the rut, I'm in a different state that I've never been before. And that's a little different than the way John does it, which is fine. But what I do typically is scout the edges, and I'm looking for sign that's telling me when or where a buck is choosing to enter and exit that. And then typically I would set up on that. Not real super complicated. Find the bedding area, take your best guess at how that buck is entering and leaving, and then set up on it and then adjust fire. Other people would call that like an observation hunt, like Dan Infault. He kind of popularized that term on the Hunting Beast forum. And so he would say, you would make an observation sit where you might hang back a little bit further than you typically might, see how the deer are using that area, and then move in. I've seen my buddies from the hunting public do that all over the country. And they will go to a new state. They will hang back. They'll see how the deer are using this particular area, and then they'll move in on the next hunt for the kill. It's very effective. You have to be aggressive. You have to be willing to blow out the area. And when you're going in for a kill like that.
For freelancing, you almost have to do that, because for freelancing, you can't go in the afternoon physically into the interior of a bedding area and scout it for sign, because obviously you're going to blow the deer out of it. So when you're freelancing, you almost are tied to doing the perimeter stuff or viewing it from a distance one day.
That's right.
Readjusting the next. But when I'm postseason scouting and I'm physically going in bedding areas and I'm covering every inch of it, I can blow every deer out of there. I could care less. I'm 6 months from deer season. Those deer are all going to be back in there. Everything's going to be copacetic back to normal by deer season. So I can scrutinize every inch of that bedding area and every inch of the property I want to look at without concern about spooking deer like you'd have to be, during season. So when I'm going into a bedding area, I'm looking for mass trees. A lot of times when I cross river with waders or go across a lake, in a boat or a canoe or whatever the case may be, I've lost a lot of hunters right there by using waders, hip boots, and boats. You've lost probably at least 90 to 95% of your competition. When we were in Indiana last year, I saw in that complete huge area, I saw one other hunter in a boat. Greg, do you remember that? Where we were last year? Just nobody else does that because it's more work. So once you get back into those areas, a lot of times they open up. They'll have brush along the edge of the river when you cross it. But a lot of times you get back into there and they open up into a little bit more open, sparse brush and stuff. And, I look for oaks. I look for the same sign I would look for hunting early season. I'm looking for mass if it's there. And if there is, I'll see what kind of sign was there from the previous rut. Is there rubs around that area? Is there possibly a couple old scrapes by these oaks? Or maybe there's a little opening in a bedding area and it's got multiple runways converging through it. I killed a buck in 2004 this way in an autumn olive patch with a 20-yard opening in the center of it. So I'm just looking for congested sign, rubs. I'm looking for taller rubs, possible scrapes. But usually when you're in bedding areas, you don't see a lot of scrapes. It's pretty rare actually to see scrapes in a swamp. So I'm just looking for the most congested sign, because I know if I'm hunting there during the rut, the mature bucks are going to be pushing the does around. So those does and bucks are going to be moving around during the course of the day. And wherever, if I'm in the most congested sign and runways I can find, odds are, and I'm a percentage guy, I hunt according to percentages, the percentages are higher that something's going to go through that more congested runway area that I'm at than someplace else.
Now, John, I know you don't factor wind direction into your strategy when it comes to avoiding deer winding you.
Correct.
Because of your scent control.
Right.
But does the wind direction impact where you want to hunt in a bedding area at all? Because many times folks talk about bucks preferring to check a bedding area on the downwind side so they can more efficiently do travel and check places. Is that something you key in at all?
I actually will set up places where I assume deer are coming in from the downwind side because I know I'm not going to get winded and I'll get that opportunity. So in Michigan, I've killed 2 150-inch bucks because I was hunting at a scrape area, and I set when I'm hunting in a scrape area, if it's in a bedding area or in a transition zone that's relatively wide, that has adequate security cover. If there's a tree on the south side or southeast side, because wind's typically out of the north or northwest predominantly in the fall, I will set a tree up about 20 to 25 yards on the downwind side of the scrapes where I have a 25-yard shot to the physical scrapes, and I have the 25-yard, because I'm only shooting 40 pounds, so I only have 25-yard distance. And I also make a shooting lane 25 yards to the south or southeast of the tree. So if a deer circles and comes in from downwind because he doesn't want to be, scrape areas are always in a little open area. And a lot of times mature bucks don't want to be in that open zone during daylight hours. So I'll set that up, and on 2 different occasions, I've had monster bucks come in and circle downwind, and I've shot them on the downwind side. That's the cool thing about scent control also, is you can set up on the downwind side, and you can use bucks coming in from the downwind side to your advantage because you're not worried about getting winded.
Greg, what about with you when it comes to wind direction and that helping your kind of scout the edge, find the sign approach? But I'm assuming wind direction factors into that as well, though, too?
Yeah, John pretty much outlined it very succinctly there, but the bucks, even if you're John and you don't pay attention to the wind, the bucks are 100%. They live and die by their noses. So to ignore that is not smart. I have seen way too many times, and buddies in camp that I've been hunting with have seen way too many times, these bucks cruising the downwind side of a bedding area. They check the whole thing, literally just by kind of slowly walking down the edge, sniffing the trails, and they know everything that is in that bedding area. So they don't even necessarily have to go in there. So using that to your advantage and setting up on the downwind side in a place that, it's a little easier for John, is since he doesn't worry as much about the wind. So his placement is a little bit easier. But for those of us that do pay attention to our wind direction and getting busted, it's a little harder to set up on that route because you have to really pay attention to where you're at and where your wind's going. Understanding thermals, understanding how wind currents work is important. It's a bit of an advanced kind of strategy or tactic that hunters need to learn, kind of like reading a topo map. I would say if you don't understand thermals, how they rise and how they fall and how it impacts how the deer use the area, then you need to spruce up your game there, hunter, because you need to understand that, because bucks do. And they always use the wind to their advantage. So you got to find a way to use that against them. And if you know that there's a bedding area in a bottom, like a lot of times the does will congregate in bottoms, especially in like hill country, right? That's usually the thickest part of the area down in the bottom. It's where all the briars are. It's where all the brush is. All that stuff is typically in the bottoms, and that's typically where a lot of does bed. The bucks typically don't want to go in there just for fun. They would rather skirt the edge, smell everything that's in there by coming on the downwind side, and then if there's nothing in there that excites them, they just move on to the next spot. So I definitely factor wind into every hunt, both how I can use it to my advantage and how a buck in the area would use it to his advantage.
You mentioned the thermals, Greg. one of the rut locations you guys discuss in the book are thermal hubs or thermal draft hubs. Key thing, like you mentioned, in hill country. Can you talk a little bit about why or first, what does that mean? What, for folks that aren't familiar, can you describe a thermal hub, how to identify it, and then how to hunt it? Because as you mentioned, the wind can be tricky in these types of locations. And as you described, you need to understand the thermals. But also, even with an understanding of the thermals, it's still kind of tough because there's certain parts of the day when the thermals are going to hurt you in these locations, certain parts of the day when the thermals will help you. And navigating that timing and where to set up your stand or saddle within that location is not simple. Can you touch on all that?
So, yeah. And yes, it's a great question. So first of all, let's define a thermal hub, and it's different for everybody. John, why don't you define a thermal hub as we talk about it in the book, and then I'll talk about my experience hunting around it. How's that work for you?
Yeah, that'll work. That'll be fine. Thermals in the morning are going up as the temperature is rising. Thermals are rising. Your odor is rising. In the evening, is once the temperatures start cooling, your thermals are going down. So if you're hunting hill country, and let's say you're on a side hill and you've got a runway up above you and you've got a runway down below you, no matter whether you're hunting morning or evening, one of those runways, there's an excellent possibility of getting winded because either way, something's going to be downwind of you or thermally downwind of you. So a thermal hub is, let's say in the evening when thermals are falling, a buck can actually come down in the lower side of a saddle on the bottom side of a hill, and because all the thermals are going down, they can actually smell if there has been any doe activity up on the side of that ridge because all that wind is coming down into that saddle, and that's a thermal hub. That's a collection area basically for all the thermals coming down the side of that hill. I did want to say one thing about the scent lock, and I've got a very interesting statistic. And I'm not tied in the wool to scent lock, but it's the only clothing company because they own the patent on using activated carbon. And in my opinion, activated carbon is the only thing that works at controlling your human odor. From 1965 through 1996, I killed 10 record book bucks. When I started using scent lock correctly, because I used scent lock in 96, but I wasn't using it properly and taking care of it properly. When I was in 97, from 1997 up until last Sunday, I killed 46 book bucks. So I've killed 46 book bucks while using scent lock from 97 through 2024 so far, and 10 from 65 through 96. You do the math. That's a pretty healthy difference.
True.
Yeah. What I was going to say about thermal hubs is maybe to define it a little bit more clearly. So if you think about where multiple, mainly in hill country, where multiple ridge systems kind of dump into one. Like if you can imagine a satellite image, you typically would have a bottom and it kind of meanders and you got ridges on both sides. And then typically that bottom will terminate at a kind of a bowl where there will be multiple ridge systems that kind of dump into one main bottom. And that confluence of multiple ridge systems dumping into one location is what is typically referred to as a thermal hub. And if you think about the math of it, right, or the physics of it, when the wind is, the thermals are kind of falling, everything, it's going to follow those low points. So the wind is going to drop into those ridges, the cuts, ravines, whatever you call them in your region. And the thermals are going to fall into those low points, and it's going to follow the ridge system all the way down, and it's going to all congregate right there in that bowl. And what a buck can do is he can skirt that thermal hub. A lot of times he'll do it in the mornings. He'll be low, skirting that, because in the mornings before the sun comes out, before it starts heating up the air, your thermals are falling, right? They fall when they're cold and they rise when they're hot. It's thermal activity. So in the morning before the sun comes up, your thermals are falling and they're going down into that little thermal hub. As soon as the sun comes up and starts warming up the air, your thermals start to rise. So a rule of thumb that I have kind of learned through the years and watching a lot of people have success is to hunt low early and then move as the sun warms up. Move, because once the wind switches and those thermals start rising, anything that comes above you, any buck that comes above you, you're busted. You're not going to get away unless, you have a full scent lock routine and you are confident in it, then that's a different story. But for folks that don't have that system, as soon as the thermals start rising, you got to move. And I can illustrate this perfectly. My good buddy Carl, last year, John, you were there. You saw this happen.
Yep.
We were hunting in Indiana on public land, and he did that strategy to a T. So Carl found a thermal hub, so a ridge system that all dumped down into one spot. And it was shredded with sign all around the thermal hub. Call it the bottom third of the hillside. So, you got a 200 foot hill. The bottom third of that is where all the sign was in this particular thermal hub. Carl figured that out. He found it by scouting, and he realized that he had this opportunity to hunt low in the morning in case that buck came through there in the morning. He had a plan. He called his shot. He said, look, the wind, the thermals are going to switch at like 8:30 in the morning. That's when, the forecast is to change. And he said, I'm going to move up the hill as soon as my wind shifts. And I found another spot that I think a bench that I think that buck is going to walk once it warms up. That's what he did. He went in the morning in the dark and he set up low. About 2 hours later, when the wind started to switch and the thermals started to rise, got down, he moved up, and he shot that buck on the exact trail that he called about 10 minutes after he got in that tree. So as a general rule of thumb, you can hunt low in the mornings, but then you have to move. You have to get out of there before your thermals switch and then everything above you screwed.
So, okay, I want to take that one step further. So if you were going to hunt during the rut and you're hunting a thermal hub location, as you just defined it, where you've got like a bowl and a bunch of ridges dropping down to the bottom, usually at the bottom there's oftentimes a big hub scrape too, or a primary scrape. That's also a concentration of scent. Yep. So a lot of deer like to hit those scrapes and ends up being created there. So you've got all these things happening there in the early morning. So you're recommending hunt low in the early morning. I imagine where the best convergence of those trails is, or where that big scrape is, or whatever it is. And you're hoping that the thermals that are dropping will keep your scent pooled down low with you, and you can kill a deer before he gets down there. When you were to move later in the morning for the rest of the day, now you've got a lot of options. It's simple when you're trying to hunt down at the bottom where that big scrape is or where that convergence of all the trails is. But in the afternoon, now you've got maybe 4 different points that are all dropping down. You've got ridges on either side all around you. You could pick any one of those, and you will now have an entire hillside to pick from and or a ridge top to pick from. How do you pick the spot for your afternoon with the rising thermals when you have so many more options? What are you thinking about that?
It's way harder to pin it down. And that's why the phase of the rut is so important for this. If you're going to move up and hunt, you're exactly right, Mark, where the deer have way more options to go. What you really want to be is in the seek phase of the rut, the pre-rut, where the deer are really covering ground, because your chances of a deer walking through there are much better, as opposed to the peak rut where they are traveling less. As we learned about earlier, the way John described the peak rut, the deer start moving less. And then the post rut, when they start traveling again to seek out does that haven't been bred, that is your best opportunity to hunt higher on. And I would find let's just use Carl's example. This is what he did, and it worked. What he did is he found a small little bench that gave the deer, it was at the top third of the hillside. So on the top third, he set up on a bench that would give a buck an advantage for travel, because they're lazy, just like us. They don't want to walk on the steepest terrain as possible if they can avoid it. They're going to find a little bench or something like that that's going to give them an advantage. And if you think about a buck could walk that that ridge system on the top third, and when the wind is blowing towards him or the thermals are rising, he can smell the entire valley below him, the whole thing, just by slowly walking down the ridge. So what it takes is a little bit of experience to understand where bucks like to do that. And they typically like to do that on the top third of the ridge. And this isn't my idea. I didn't come up with this. Lots of people preach this. You can read books about this. Hunters have known this for decades, right? That top third of the ridge where the thermals are rising, that is, if you can find a little bench or some sort of little pinch point in that zone, that can be gold for a rut phase location.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, the does don't have to physically be there. If they pass through within an hour or two earlier, their scent's going to still rise up, in the morning up the side of those hills. One really cool way of trying to explain thermals is if you're sitting around a campfire after dark, okay, the temperatures are dropping. So that means your thermals are coming down. So you've got your fire, which is hot. So it's hot, so the thermals are going up because of the fire, and the environmental thermals are coming down, so they're clashing with each other. And that's why when you're sitting around a fire, even if there's no wind, the smoke from the fire tends to move around the area, and you're always getting up and moving if you want to stay out of the smoke. It's because the thermals are clashing with the environmental temperatures dropping against the thermals from the fire heat going up, and they clash, and then the winds just go in different directions. Even if there's no wind, zero wind on your cell phone when you look at AccuWeather or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And I know that's it's a pretty basic concept, but I talk to hunters all over the country who don't know what thermals are. They've never heard of it, or whatever the reason might be. But as a general rule, your thermals they're a slave to the temperature. If the temperature is falling, thermals are falling. If the temperature is rising, thermals are rising. It's just a general rule. It's an easy way to think about it for a hunter. If you've never understood wind currents and stuff like that, I'm not a meteorologist, but I do know that when temperatures fall, thermals fall, and that when temperatures rise, thermals rise. It's an easy way to think about it.
In hill country, you better know how to hunt thermals. In flat land, it's not quite as bad, but still in the thermals.
That's right.
If there's no wind and you're in flat country, in the evening, you got to be cautious, because your thermals are falling, and if something comes close to your tree, they could very well wind you because of the thermals coming down.
Yeah. Tricky thing is, in like a hill country setup like you just described, Greg, you have two shifts that happen during the day. So you've got you want to have a low spot early in the morning, but then partway through the morning it warms up. So now you want to move high, and then that works pretty good until prime time in the evening, and then again they're falling again. So then you want to move low again. So it can be tricky if you're trying to chase that, but
it can be tricky.
Yeah.
You're not just chasing the thermals, you're chasing how the bucks use the thermals. So you're not chasing the thermals.
And they're gonna.
Yeah. They're gonna definitely move according to thermals in hill country.
Yeah. I'm heading to hunt some Kentucky public land next week, hill country, just like we're describing. And this is not my bread and butter. So I'm asking a lot of questions about this because I'm trying to get spruced up and ready for it. Making sure my plans.
In the books too, by the way.
Yes. Okay, so we have a bunch of things that we have not gotten to cover yet that I wanted to, but we are using up a lot of your time. So I want to kind of shift into like a rapid fire type mode here, guys, where I'm going to ask you guys for your quick thoughts on a topic, and in your mind, try to do like the 1 minute summary, like the fast, here's the most important thing you got to know about this one thing. And we're going to try to rapid fire roll through a few more important rut things just to make sure someone listening on November 7th, 2024 has a little bit of everything they can use over this next week, okay? So, rapid fire. Greg, really quick. Calling during the rut. What are your couple quick, most important thoughts for calling during peak rut?
I love it. I love rattling. I'm not afraid to rattle. I don't typically get real super aggressive with it. I typically like to do a little bit more of like a sparring type session that I actually learned from John. He describes it in some of his other books, and we talk about rattling in this book. But yeah, I love rattling. I am a fan. I do it frequently.
John, same question to you. Quick thoughts on calling during the rut.
Okay, we have a complete chapter on using fake tactics in the book, but I exactly like Greg described. It's pretty rare if I'm hunting in the interior of the bedding area during the rut that I don't do a couple sparring sequences early in the morning, maybe 45 minutes after daylight. Sometime around 8 o'clock, and do 2 sequences on an evening sit, about an hour before dark. So I'm not a big grunt call guy. I've had a lot more success doing sparring sequences. When I'm out of state, I will do more aggressive rattle sequences because there's a lot more mature bucks. They're used to hearing that aggressiveness like you see on TV. But when I'm hunting in Michigan, it's almost always subtle sparring sequences. I think that arouses their attention. And
one other thing before we go. Don't rattle if you're in an open area where where a buck can see you from a long way away. It won't work. What that buck will do is he will come to the point just close enough to where he can see where the rattling came from. And if he does not confirm it with his eyes, he will not come in. So do not rattle in a big open woods. It won't work, at least for a mature deer. Maybe a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old will come in, but a big deer isn't coming in. You have got to be obscure. Your location has to be obscure. So a thick bedding area, thick something. If you're going to rattle for that buck to come in bow range, he can't see the source of the noise. That is important because you will screw it up like I have done many times by rattling where deer can see me.
Now, maybe there is an asterisk next to that, which is unless you are using a decoy, possibly. And that's
fair.
That's the next question I had, because I grew up by living by the gospel of precision bow hunting by John and Chris Eberhart. And within that book, early on, one of the major themes in that book is to not use a lot of things that draw attention to you in places like Michigan. So decoys being a perfect example of that. So I grew up for a long time being terrified by the idea of using decoys because I thought it would spook every deer in the world in a heavily pressured place like Michigan. But I see in one of the chapters in your new book, John, you talking about using doe decoys. So I'm curious, real quick, fast summary, what's your evolved view on decoys these days? It's not really evolved. I still very, very rarely use a decoy in Michigan. I use decoys a lot when I go out of state. I would never go out of state without taking a decoy with me, a hard-bodied 3D decoy. They're a pain to carry around, but I'll tell you what, if you're doing a rattle sequence and you're in a more open area, and I've done it multiple times in Iowa and Kansas, if you put a decoy out and a deer is coming and it's 100 yards away and he sees it, he'll come right in. If he's not with a doe, he'll come right in. I've actually put a decoy out on the corner of a big cornfield in Iowa where, they're like, here's a corner, and I had the decoy up here so you could see it from either direction. And I had a buck come out, I bet it was damn near a half a mile, probably 3/8 of a mile down the field edge. He saw that decoy and he came right to it. But in Michigan, because we've got so many does and we've just got so many deer, the odds of a doe coming in and spooking from the decoy, coming in within 3 to 5 yards and doing the peekaboo deal and then blowing and then running off is really, really high. So I don't do it in Michigan very, very often because unless I'm in an area where I know I'm only going to see a couple of deer, then I may use it. But if I'm in an area where the chances of seeing multiple does and fawns and subordinate bucks where they might come in and hit it with their antler and then spook and blow, I just rarely use them in Michigan anymore. I've killed a couple bucks with them in the 80s, but they were 2.5-year-olds. So on 3.5 older bucks in Michigan, I don't use them, but out of state, I use them a lot. Okay. Greg, any decoy thoughts?
I don't hunt with decoys. So, I'm sure John is 100% right in that they can be very effective, but I'm a minimalist at heart with gear, so I don't carry stuff like that ever. So I can't speak to that. I can say that without a decoy, if you're in an open area and you need a big buck to come in mature into bow range, and he can see your area from 100 yards away, he ain't coming in.
Yeah.
Without a decoy.
Okay, another one for you then, Greg. Advice for making all-day sits more comfortable or enjoyable, especially if you're doing what we do, which is hunting in a saddle. Any advice on saddle hunting comfort tips for all day, or any other part of the all-day piece? Quick thoughts here.
It's just hard, an all day sit. I used to love listening to the early days of Wired to Hunt, when like the Holyfield days, when you would start talking about, okay, it's like time for all day sits to start. And there was always this little trepidation with you, because you're like, it's like, I know I need to sit all day, but it sucks. Mm-hmm. It's hard. And it feels like grinding.
Yes.
I've yet to figure out a way around that. Maybe a box blind would do that with maybe a fridge in there,
big recliner,
and maybe some Wi-Fi. Yeah, maybe that would make an all-day sit easier. But man, they're just hard. So I find myself almost never sitting all day. I haven't sat in a tree from daylight to dark in several years. Now, I will hunt all day, meaning I won't leave the woods. I'll come down, I'll maybe move to a different area, maybe move 100 yards away, or do a little midday scouting and slowly kind of slip through an area and then find another spot for the last 4 or 5 hours of the day. But man, hunting all day in the same tree without getting down, it's just hard. It's more discipline and mind and willpower than it is anything else. Because I don't care what saddle you're in, what tree stand you're in, you are going to get uncomfortable. I don't care who it is. You are going to get uncomfortable, and you just have to grit your teeth and go through it. And I'm soft. I don't like to be uncomfortable. So I find myself not doing much of that anymore.
All right, John. What would you say on that one?
Well, as you know, Mark, I've done a ton of all-day sits, and I've killed a lot of bucks during the middle of the day. Hunting all day is very grueling, especially if it's sunny out, because it gets so hot in the middle of the day, and you don't see a lot of deer in the middle of the day. And so many hunters will give all-day sits maybe 1 or 2 shots, and because they don't see much, they give up on it. Well, if you went out as a hunter, an avid hunter, and you hunted 2 evenings in a row and you didn't see much for deer activity, would you quit hunting evenings? Of course you wouldn't. But I'm a percentage guy. And like I said, I've killed 7 out of my 20 book bucks in Michigan that were shot between November 1 and 14 were during 11 to 3 o'clock. So I know the advantage of hunting midday, an all-day sit, if it's in the right type of area and it's during the rut phases. So I don't have any issues with discomfort. I can go to the bathroom 1 or 2 in my saddle. Either way, it doesn't matter without getting out of my tree. I always take food. On an all-day sit, I will literally change my clothes 4 times on an all-day sit, because I will walk in really light clothed, very light, so I don't overheat. Once I get up in the tree, my body cools off. I'll take off my sunlock jacket, put on some undergarments, put my sunlock jacket back on, and then when it gets like 10, 11 o'clock, that starts heating up. I'll do the same. I'll take off my sunlock jacket, take off my undergarments, put them in my backpack, so I'm lighter, so I'm not overheating in the middle of the day. 2, 3 o'clock, as it starts to cool, I'll rechange and put my layers back on. This is only on my top, not my bottom, just top. And then before I get out of the tree, because I'm going to have a long walk out, I will again take off my jacket and take off my undergarments so I don't overheat and sweat on my ass.
You're insane.
Well,
sorry.
You are insane, John.
Man.
You are insane.
I'm very comfortable.
What is wrong with you?
Day.
I just can't. I'm over here having a hard time not breaking down laughing here.
You are laughing. You're not breaking. You're not having a hard time. You're doing it.
I just want to make sure I heard right. Did you say that you're going number 2 while staying in your saddle?
Absolutely. Yeah. You want to hear
You know,
the process? I
You don't
gotta
wanna-
tell you the process.
I don't know.
It's super easy.
oh no, don't do it. Don't do
You
it.
just take a
Don't do
gallon
it, John.
Ziploc baggie, you take the saddle, you either pull it up under your shoulders, under your armpits, or you slide the saddle down above your knees and you just under your pants and go in the bag and then wipe and put the bag back in your backpack and pull your pants up and pull the saddle back up to hunt. It's literally easy.
So remember,
Oh, that's amazing.
so the first time I heard this story, Mark, John told us at hunting camp that he likes to take craps in gallon Ziploc bags.
Oh, wow.
And then the part that got us, that broke us down, was he said, but he squeezes all the air out, to like zip it up so there's less room, and all the shit smell is just, and then he puts it in his bag.
You have to deal with the smell.
What is wrong with you?
Oh,
Oh my word!
this is one of the
don't do that.
all-time best Wired Hunt moments in all the decade plus years we've done these episodes. That right there. That's one of the best. Thank you for that, John.
You're more than welcome. I'm sure I'll do it multiple times in the rest of my life.
Oh, wow.
So there's whenever we do an update on the book for version 2, we'll make sure that John details that process with illustrations in detail to show you how to get maximum crap air out of your Ziploc bag to take up less room in your pack.
It's in the book, Greg.
So your McDonald's can.
It's in the book. It's in there already. That's in the book.
Yeah. Well,
oh wow.
I was talking about the detailed process about it with illustrations and everything.
Oh,
we need to
man.
add that in there.
That's amazing.
It's really easy to do, to be honest with you.
Absolutely amazing. And I think maybe that might be the best place to end the whole episode right there. There's so much in these books because you guys are crazy. You don't just write one book and release it. You launch 3 at a time. So there's 3 of these. Can you give me a quick rundown other than what we've talked about? We've covered a lot of the rut side of things, and there's still more that we haven't got to cover, and then so much more outside of the rut. Could one of you or both of you give me a quick take on what folks can expect to see in the book and then where they can buy it?
There is, you mind if I go, Greg? There is
I would love it if you would go, John.
Everything to do with deer hunting, whether you're a bow hunter, a gun hunter, crossbow, muzzleloader, everything to do with hunting deer. I don't care what type of property you're on, if you're on managed property, public land, heavily pressured rural areas. The information is in this book. Now, the book's key on hunting pressured areas, because once you become successful at hunting any semblance of pressured areas for mature bucks, you can go any place else in the country and be relatively successful and be a threat to the mature bucks you're hunting. Because when you go to a less pressured area, it's just easier. And you've got all the foundation for hunting pressured areas, so it's that much easier. There's 27 chapters in this book. We actually, Mark, you contributed a couple short kill stories to this book. So did Andy May. So did Garrett Crawl from DIY.
I think it's DIY Hunter.
Sportsman. DIY Sportsman.
Oh, that's it, right? Yeah, you got it.
And then
DIY Sportsman.
Yeah, Ernie has a couple kill out. There's 84 in Greg and myself. There's 84 short, condensed 3 to 5 paragraph kill stories within this book. There's photos of the kills. They're in locations within the book that lend credibility to what you're reading at the time. But again, there's 27 chapters. And when we wrote this, it was like going to be 800 and some pages. And we just couldn't put it out in a single book. So, each one of these books is basically the same length as all 3 of the other books I wrote. So we had to do it in 3 volumes. That's the only way we could do it. And it's available on Tethered's website. So if you Google www.tethered, that's TETHRD.com/DIY bucks, it'll take you right to the page. And there's no stone unturned in these books. This covers everything.
Would you add anything,
I like
Greg?
to describe it a little bit differently, Mark. Yes, every single topic that is even remotely related to bow hunting is in this book. Preseason, postseason, scouting, the rut, scrapes, rubs, everything. How to hunt corn, how not to hunt corn, how to rattle. Everything is in this book. When John came to me a year and a half ago and said he was thinking about writing his final book, of which he's written many, and they have influenced me and a great number of hunters a great deal. And John came to me and he said, Greg, I want to distill down my 50 plus years of bow hunting experience into one book. And I was like, holy crap, that's got the potential to be like the most inclusive book on hunting that's ever been written. And so I was really excited about it. And that's what John did. He distilled 50 years of successful big buck hunting in pressured areas, and he distilled it all down into 3 volumes. So it's a lot of information, but everything you could hope to know about bow hunting is in there. And John put all of his experience in there, and a bunch of us helped him, right? Like Mark, you helped, I helped, and Andy, and all these people helped John do this. But ultimately what this book is John's incredible record of success in 3 volumes. And I promise you, every single hunter on the planet will learn something. It might not change your life. It might not revolutionize how you hunt if you're an experienced hunter, but I guarantee you're going to learn things from this book that you didn't know before you read it.
It will make you think about the way you're hunting, and it'll probably make you want to change a lot of the ways that you are hunting. And it was written in such detail that any novice or experienced hunter can easily understand what we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I know there's a lot of folks who listened to our podcast that we did earlier this year, John, who have been waiting for the books, because we kind of teased the books then, but they weren't available yet. So I know if folks haven't already seen the news online or somewhere, definitely take note. They're available now over there at the Tethered website. They're great. I haven't got to read every part of every one of them yet, but I've been looking in various locations for relevant things as I'm thinking through ideas and as I was preparing for this, and as I knew it would be. Lots of great stuff. And then this wonderful surprise number 2 tip as well that everyone will have to search for in the book. And we'll have this moment, this podcast moment will live on forever. I still am having a hard time processing it. So with that in mind, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to do this, for sharing maybe the best story we've ever had in the podcast, and for helping me as a hunter so much over the years. Both of you have been great friends, great teachers, and I appreciate you both.
Thanks for the opportunity, Mark.
All right, and that's it for us today. Again, I'll plug John and Greg's book here, The Ultimate Guide to DIY Books. And without further ado, let's get you out into the woods, into a tree or a blind or whatever you're doing. Get out there, have a great time hunting. Good luck. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.
It's that time of the year again. I'm back. Marcus Kenyon, how are you son of a gadwall? You look terrible. I'm just kidding, or am I? I'm sorry I'm late. I crashed my recumbent bicycle into the side of a Quiznos, and I know what you're thinking. I am as sober as a newborn blue crab. I swear to you, this is just kombucha. I'm watching the gut health. You gotta do it as you get older. Also, I'm wearing this ankle bracelet that makes a beep beep sound if I have a drop of the stuff. Also alerts the authorities, who in turn alert my parole officer, so there'll be none of that in the studio today. I promise you. Let's get go. Oh, you're queuing it up already. Okay, thought we'd learned a lesson this year, but I guess not. Here we go.
I love those B.I.G. big white tails. Those stinky rotten B.I.G. big white tails. I love those B.I.G. big W-H-I-T-E tails. I love those B.I.G. big white tails.
Big white tails, big white tails, big white tails are great. Oh, what fun it is to sit in a freezing cold tree all day. big white tails, big white tails, big white tails are great. Oh, what fun it is to sit in a freezing cold tree all day, dashing through the woods, for the morning light turns gray, across the fields and draws, creeping all the way, I climb into the tree, big bucks are on the way. What fun it is to sit and wait for a gosh darn deer all day. Oh, big... I'm sorry, what is this? Pizzicato strings? Who do you think I am, Enya? Get this out of here. I don't want to hear it. Thank you. Big white tails, big white tails, big white tails are great. Oh, what fun it is to sit in a freezing cold tree all day. My hopes and dreams are high. The rut is finally here. Mark said it's the most wonderful time to kill a white-tailed deer. Pinch points and petting's where you'll find me hanging 20 feet in a tree. Grunt tubes my bow and Spectre camo, this really can't be beat. A day or two ago, I thought that this was fun. But now I'm frozen to my seat and the good times, they are gone. I've ate up all my snacks, my hands and toes are numb. And when I climbed down from my stand, that son of a buck decided to come.
I love those B.I.G. big white tails, those stinky rotten B.I.G. big white tails.
I love those B.I.G. big W-H-I-T-E tails. I love those big white tails all day. I don't know why this is happening, I swear to God. Oh, officer, what seems to be the problem here? Oh, this? I don't know why this is happening. It must be a malfunction. You know, sometimes this happens when the batteries run low. You don't need to smell that. That's just kombucha. Okay, yes, you've got me. It's Everclear and Pacific Cooler Capri Sun. I am so sorry. I don't know why my life has brought me here. Marcus, I'm so sorry. Enjoy the rut or whatever. Good luck. Boys, good to see you. Hayden, it's been a while. Hey, sorry I'm late. I crashed my Pontiac Aztec into a light pole and had to walk the rest of the way, but I'm here now. That's what matters. Can you give me a glass of scotch, please, Hayden? Just 2 rocks in there. I don't like ice. We're starting already. This is happening. Okay, just give me the glass. Thank you. Okay, here we go. It's the most wonderful time to kill deer. With the rut now just starting and dashing and darting and lanes cut and cleared. It's the most wonderful time to kill deer. There's far too much ice in this glass. It's the happiest season of all. There's got to be at least 12 cubes. With grunting and bleeding and cold fronts and sleeting, the last weeks of fall. It's the happiest season of all. There'll be pictures for posting and bragging and boasting and truck beds with big bucks in tow. There'll be narrow missed stories and tales of near glories of booner bucks missed with our bows. It's the most wonderful time to kill deer. Not just one, maybe 2. There'll be no does of blowing and luminox glowing and blood trails so clear. It's the most wonderful time to kill deer. Hey, excuse me, can I have a napkin, please? I just spilled some scotch on my loafers. I can't have dirty loafers in the studio. Yeah, thank you. Tailgate beers for drinking and big bucks a slinking and chasing and scent checking does. There'll be fighting and scraping and no more escaping and arrows shot true hitting home. Key change? What? No one told me. It's the most wonderful time to kill deer. I was very unprepared for this. There'll be much morning sitting and cold fronts hitting the dawn crisp and clear. It's the most wonderful time Oh, the most wonderful time. Yes, the most wonderful time to kill deer. There's too much ice in the glass. 2 rocks.